The election is over. President Trump is filling out his cabinet, and Democrats are figuring out which path to chart forward next. Here to go on the record is Scott Tranter, Director of Data Science from our friends at Decision Desk HQ. You may have seen their latest profile in the New York Times. Scott, as always, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Scott, just to jump right into it, it has been a rapid fire cabinet nomination process for President-elect Trump. He's nominated a number of popular picks or seemingly popular picks, like Senator Marco Rubio for Secretary of State, Congresswoman Lori Chavez DeRemer for Labor Secretary. But there's been some controversial picks, like Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense, or Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for Health and Human Services, and of course Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence. What's your read on the situation? Do you think all of these picks ultimately make it through after January?
Yeah, no, I think a lot of them do. I mean, look, we've already had our first recusal with Matt Gaetz, being nominated as potential DOJ head of DOJ and having to remove himself. For those who are surprised by some of these picks, I can't say I am. Look, these are the people that he likes. These align with a lot of his views, and we've already been through one Trump administration, and so a lot of these picks line up with what you think. Whether it's a Pete Hegseth, who has some pretty vocal ideas on how to run the DOD, and as a Fox News star who Donald Trump has been watching for years now, all the way to Marco Rubio, who has behind the scenes really pushed for the job and positioned himself for it, and then even Lori DeRemer Chavez, she represents how the MAGA part of the Republican Party thinks about labor and thinks about unions. They won a lot of the Upper Midwest based on those pro union views. So I don't think anyone should be super surprised by this, but it is certainly something to watch because odds say that not all these folks are going to make it through the nominating process, but we know Donald Trump's making phone calls for it, and the Senate has said that they would even consider recess appointments for some. So I expect a pretty fun spring as we sort some of these positions out.
Yeah, we'll certainly be on our toes in our field. Look, I want to go across the aisle to the Democrats. We know that a lot of Democratic lawmakers, Democratic officials are pushing President Biden to enact a number of executive orders in an effort to maybe stall some progress or block some progress President Trump's administration would make on a number of fronts. I've heard some criticism of this, saying that, look, this is going against what people say, what, Republicans would say was the will of the people in electing Donald Trump. So is this a risky move for Democrats to take in pushing Biden to make these sweeping executive orders, or is this business as usual for an outgoing president?
I think it's a little bit business as usual. I think it is a little bit potential overreach in the sense that, look, any executive order that the President Biden does between now and the end on day one can be reversed, and I don't know that Donald Trump's incoming administration is going to let us some of these slip by. It may delay a few things, especially in some of the interior, environmental, and agricultural ones that are being floated. But by and large, I think this is, look, the people have spoken. The election was clear. Donald Trump's going to come in on January 20th, and he's going to govern the way he wants to govern. If Joe Biden wants to govern the way he wants to the last couple months, that's fine. But I think this is a lot of tit for tat, and I think most voters just want to move on.
Vice President Kamala Harris and, of course, her running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, held a Zoom call with DNC donors this week. There's been a lot of questions as to what path she charts forward, after she leaves office in January. We've heard some chatter that she would be considering governor of California or potentially running for the presidency in 2028. But she says, according to reports, she's staying in the fight. What do you expect Harris and Walz, for that matter, to do going forward?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think a Tim Walz is going to have to really be deference to a Harris and see what she wants to do going into the 2028 cycle. Minnesota could theoretically, governor is obviously a position he's got. We'll see what the Senate holds for Minnesota going forward. But I think a lot of Tim Walz's future kind of depends on Harris is going to do. Now, I think Harris, if she wants to run for governor of California, would probably be the preeminent front runner. That's probably the highest position that she could have to kind of stay in the spotlight over the next 2 or 3 years, because that's the issue for a lot of these potential Democratic 2028 nominees, is how do they stay relevant and in the news over the next couple of years. And Harris right now is without a job in a couple of months. So I'm looking pretty closely. I mean, if it's not the governorship, it's certainly a high profile fundraising PAC type of political operation going into the 2026 midterms. But I find it notable that she's out there saying that she wants to stay in the fight. So it's clear she's looking for something to do.
Well, and speaking of the 2026 midterms, I mean, look, you already hear Democrats talking about how they need to change and tweak their messaging ahead of the midterms and also ahead of some very crucial off-year races in 2025, notably Virginia and New Jersey. And, I guess looking at the final vote tallies, if you will, of the general election, I mean, clearly it was a sweep for Republicans. Trump won all 7 swing states and won the popular vote. But we've noticed that in these swing states, it was by a narrow margin. It's not like he had a sweep within each individual swing state. Do you view this as a potential glimmer of hope for Democrats that going forward, maybe things may not be as bad as they initially thought right after the election?
Yeah, look, on a raw vote total, I kind of get the point about the Democrats saying, look, we're hundreds of thousands of votes, not millions of votes away from having a different electoral outcome. I think the way, a lot of macro numbers people look at it is look at how many counties shifted right versus left. And you bring up Virginia, New Jersey is a good example. Look, Harris won Virginia, New Jersey pretty handily. But the margins were a whole lot closer than we thought, and a lot of the pundits thought, and that just goes to show that the Republicans, and specifically Donald Trump and the Republicans, have made some inroads in voters. And so I think these 2025 elections, will there be a Republican? Will the Republicans be able to take 1 or 2 governorships in those states? Will be very, very important and very tea leaf reading for us into 2026. But look, these elections, what we saw in 2024, I think that's what we're going to see for the next couple cycles. Some very, very close elections divided by hundreds of thousands or low millions of votes across 7 or 8 states. And either party, depending on the election cycle and depending on the candidate, can swing either way. It just kind of depends on what the environment is. It's close enough where either party could potentially win, like we saw in 2024.
A lot of the conversation on Capitol Hill is obviously about these cabinet picks, but we do know that Speaker Mike Johnson has a big job ahead of him. He seems to be heading towards passing a continuing resolution, also known in Washington as a CR. This would essentially punt government funding until next year, with the odds of an omnibus, making its way through the House looking pretty slim at this point. Do you think this is a good political move for the speaker going forward? I guess it could allow Trump to, put his mark on this going forward, but is Mike Johnson making a good move here?
I don't know if it's a good move, but I do know it's probably the only move, right? Like, he doesn't have a whole lot of choices. He's got a very slim majority. Donald Trump has not done him a lot of favors by picking some members out of his majority, his slim majority, to serve in the cabinet. While I don't think he's in danger of losing some seats like Florida 1 and a few others, it does mean that those special elections need to happen. So he's got the vote margin he has. You bring up the omnibus. I'm more looking at the debt ceiling vote, which is probably going to occur in Q1. When we're talking about deficits and things like that, I think Mike Johnson's probably doing the only options in front of him, and I think we're set up for some pretty big legislative fireworks in the first 6 months. Just based on, as you point out, the omnibus, debt ceiling. We have the tax rewrite bill coming up. I mean, there's quite a bit that needs to happen, and there's only a slim majority in the House. And Mike Johnson, had a rocky start to his speakership. He doesn't have the control that, say, back in the day, a Tom DeLay or a John Boehner or an Eric Cantor had. So we'll see how this all kind of plays out. But I think it's going to be a lot of fireworks in the first 6 months.
Trump is heading into his next term in January with a better understanding of how Washington works, having done this for 4 years. He also has, different people around him this time, namely Susie Wiles, a veteran Florida political strategist who will serve as his incoming chief of staff. She's someone who's very popular in Republican circles. But look, with these people around him, with his experience now from his first administration, do you expect Trump to make good on a lot of his campaign promises he, set out to make during the campaign going into his first 100 days?
Yeah, no, I expect, everything from the immigration and deportation to, attempt to reduce the size of the government to, pulling out of the Paris Accords and certainly making an attempt to take a different stance on Ukraine and Russia. I think all these things are going to happen to a certain extent, or he's certainly going to try. I mean, one thing that I've noticed, we talked about at the top of this segment is, look, he has moved very quickly to appoint or nominate a lot of high level officials. So his government going into election day, or I'm sorry, going into inauguration day is going to be a lot more filled out and a lot more organized than it was back in 2017, 2016. So, and these people know why they were elected. It's not no surprise what they were for and what they campaigned on, and they're now going to have more time to be organized. So I think a lot of those campaign promises, if not kept, there will be a sincere effort on his administration's part to actually try and get a lot of them done.
Scott, finally, as we're wrapping up the year here, going into the holiday season, I want to know what you and your team learned, or what's one thing you and your team learned from the 2024 election cycle?
Look, I always we like doing these every year, right? Because we spend all of our time looking at past trends, trying to predict the future. And if you had told me back in June that Donald Trump would be very competitive and potentially win the popular vote, win all seven battleground states, as you pointed out, I would have said that the Republicans would have had 225, 230 seats in the House and a couple more seats in the Senate. Instead, all those things happened except for the Republicans are probably going to have about 220, 221 seats in the House and only going to have 53 seats in the Senate, which are slim majorities. And so that just goes to show you that all of this time, math, and analysis, we still have some surprises. And that's why I think these elections, whether it's this cycle, the midterms, or the next 2028, which is going to be a double open primary, by the way, it's only the tip of the iceberg. There are surprises to be had, and politics is a hard thing to handicap.
Scott Tranter, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And that's it for What's America Thinking. I'm Julia Manchester. Come back next week and be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hills YouTube channel.